Hi folks, Hayden McCall speaking. Welcome along to Everything as a Service. I run iStart Technology in Business, the publisher across Australia and New Zealand, and we do what we say, technology in business. So if you're much focused in the enterprise software space and running services businesses is obviously in a target there. So housekeeping, there will be a recording. This is being recorded. A link will be emailed out to you tomorrow. So no need to sort of be taking screenshots or anything as we go. You'll get all of that, and you can scroll forward and back through that as at your leisure. Very keen to have an interactive session and hear your questions today. We will moderate those. There'll be plenty of time. Ben's presentation is about 30 minutes, plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and we'll get through that and wrap up within around about the hour. A quick thanks to our sponsor today, Financial Force. Without their help, we wouldn't have been able to run today, so thanks very much to them. Okay, so top of the hour now, and we will flick across to introduce Ben Keeps. Ben is a technology industry analyst. He's been knocking around in that role since really things cloud and as a service became things. So Ben gets around the world with industry conferences all over the place. I tend to see him in airport lounges or at industry conferences in Silicon Valley or in Australia, in Sydney or wherever. He also spends a fair bit of time slogging up the North Canterbury Hills, training for his next adventure race. So g'day Ben, how are you?
I'm awesome, Hayden, thank you.
Very good, and great to hear your voice. It's always nice to have the live presenter at the other end of the line. So I will hand over to you, Ben, at this stage, and we'll get straight into your presentation. We'll have a bit of back and forth between us as we go, but controls over to you. So just hand over to do that now.
That's awesome, and just checking that people can see my screen there.
That looks pretty good.
Brilliant. Okay. So thanks, Hayden, and thanks to Financial Force for sponsoring this webinar. Really wanted to set some context here. You know, as Hayden said, I spend a bunch of my time over in the US. I'm actually in Christchurch today, where it's a kind of a cloudy and cold day, but I do spend a bunch of my time over in Silicon Valley. And I guess what is really interesting for me and exciting for me is to take some of the stuff that I learn from spending time with organizations I help, primarily in the US, but also in Europe, and bringing it back here to New Zealand and Australia and helping our organizations to kind of better prepare themselves for the future. So that's what I'm all about. First, a little bit of context about me. So as I said, I spend a bunch of time traveling around the world, going to conferences and doing consulting and those sorts of things. But fundamentally, my kind of focus is thinking about what the future looks like, and that kind of takes a number of different routes. It's thinking about the way technology will look about in the future, but more importantly, it's really about how businesses will look in the future, because I think that we are really undergoing a fundamental shift in the way organizations work, and so increasingly we're going to have to change the way we work in order to compete. So that's kind of what gets me excited, what gets me up in the morning. Sorry about that. And in terms of the stuff that I do, I do a bunch of different things. As you heard, I'm an industry analyst, but I also do a lot of consulting, a lot of investing, and I'm also a professional director. So here there's a bunch of different organizations of many different types, some of whom I contribute to, some of whom I'm an investor in, some of whom I sit on the board of, and others of whom that I consult to. So that's kind of what I do. And so as I said before, the world has changed. It's always easy for us here in Australia and New Zealand to kind of think that things kind of stay the same and we can kind of stay in our happy little place and not change. But really, anyone who has used an Uber, who has downloaded some music or has listened to some music on Spotify maybe recently, or maybe stayed at an Airbnb, will realize that things have changed, and the world that we live in and the world that our businesses operate in is fundamentally different from what it was before. And so if we think back, only going back a decade or so, we used to, this used to be a regular scene at everyone's home, the shelf where you had DVDs, and before that VHS tapes. It used to be a bugbear and a nightmare for enterprise IT folks to have to update software, to walk around with floppy disks or maybe CD-ROMs or whatever, and update software that was installed on premises and on people's machines. It used to be the regular thing to sign long-term leases because businesses were stable, and if you were a business of 100 people, then chances are in 10 years time you would be a business of maybe 120 people, and you could sign a 10-year lease on an office complex, and you knew that you weren't going to grow or going to shrink much in that time because things were stable. It seems funny, reflecting upon this image. We all used to know exactly what time our favorite TV shows were, and we would actually schedule our life around those shows. Fast forward to today, and obviously, the entertainment that we watch is on demand, and we can get it at our leisure. And so what has really happened is that we use these things every day. I mean, we all use Netflix or the like, or Airbnb or Uber or whatever. And sometimes we use those things without taking the time to kind of stand back and think about the fundamental changes that have happened within organizations and within those businesses to enable those changes. And I think the risk of that is that sometimes disruptive elements can start which impact upon our own businesses. We may not be a cab company, we may not be an accommodation provider, but the world in which our organizations operate no longer exists or is fundamentally changing, and we need to be prepared for that, and we need to move to that. And so my thesis, I guess, and it's the thesis that's shared by many, is that all industries are shifting to being offered as a service. We've obviously seen it, very rapidly in media and entertainment. In more traditional industries, possibly, not so quick, healthcare or education, but those two are shifting much more to a service-based offering, subscription or service-based. And this is a really interesting statistic taken from the CFO magazine quite recently, that 70% of CFOs in the US say that over half of their revenue now comes from services. And that includes a bunch of different things: professional services, subscription-based services, service level agreements, and other things. And obviously this is a US statistic, but increasingly we're in a global village, a global market, and these statistics are very much relevant to our own situation. And the big thing that I'd like to get across here is that when we think about Uber, about Airbnb, about Amazon, about Netflix, it's best not to think of those as technology changes and technology disruptions, but rather as business disruptions. And that's a key message that I want to get through here. These are new business models. And so, Uber, we know, is taxi as a service. Airbnb is home as a service. WeWork is office as a service. There's all of these somewhat cliched examples. But when we see these large organizations fundamentally changing what they do to move into a service-based model, it makes for a change, and it means that we need to start thinking about what we do. And it is tempting, as I said, to think that we're in a very traditional industry, and therefore this doesn't impact upon us. And to anyone that says that, I would suggest that is exactly what the cab companies would have said 10 years ago before Uber. That is probably what the hotel companies would have said before Airbnb. Clearly, entertainment and media were already ripe for disruption, and technology was going to impact upon those. But increasingly, technology is going to impact upon all businesses, and that's not what we need to be prepared for. And the key thing is that In the old days, it was really all about capital. So the fact of the matter is that the large organizations with capital, with resources, with brand awareness, they could eat the small, essentially. You know, they could overcome any potential disruption simply by hefting their weight around the place and their capital base and resource. That's changed, and today it's very much a case of the fast eating the slow. And so fundamentally, an organization's ability to survive and prosper is predicated on its ability to innovate, to be agile, to move quickly. And so another statistic, this time from The Economist. So there's 6.8 potential mobile, social, or web subscribers. And increasingly in a lot of economies, these people are doing things, you know, they didn't have technology before. They're moving into subscription and service-based models as their first foray into these markets. And again, from The Economist, 80% of customers are wanting new consumption models. So in the past, it was very much a top-down, supplier-led situation where, as a consumer, you had an option that the supplier gave you, and if you wanted that option, you took it. If you didn't, you were kind of out of luck. Increasingly, consumers have a lot of power in this situation. And if a consumer demands a particular type of consumption model, demands to be able to acquire something via a service model, that demand needs to be met by the supplier. Otherwise, the consumer will go somewhere else. And so moving on to some of the critical factors for success with organizations that are looking to be a service-based business. The real key thing here in terms of the overarching theme is about connectivity. And so it's not just about an organization connecting to consumers and connecting to the world, but an organization connecting its own internal systems. No longer is it going to work to have, you know, a CRM system over one side and a financial ERP system over another side and maybe our website over another side. But rather, these things need to be connected and need to give us visibility over end-to-end processes within an organization. And there's a bunch of different functional processes within an organization that the system needs to be able to cover. And so for service-based businesses, it's really important to be able to qualify those opportunities. We increasingly live in a world where our prospects come from far and wide. There's a huge number of prospects, and key to being a successful service-based business is being able to qualify those opportunities accurately and quickly. So while we may have, you know, 1 million, 5 million prospective customers, to be able to quickly qualify that down to the most qualified 100,000 or whatever is increasingly important, and having the systems that allow us to do that will be key. Part of that then is that once we've got our qualified opportunities, we need to be able to deliver the right resources in the right place at the right time. And so in the old days where we may have had a planning system that was, you know, it was probably a whiteboard or Gantt charts or maybe at best a you know, Microsoft project kind of system. Increasingly, we need to have a system that is connected to our other core systems, our CRM and our ERP, so that we can make sure that we have our resource allocation absolutely perfect. Because increasingly, the profitability and the margin that comes from these service-based businesses comes from driving efficiencies when it comes to resource allocation. Part of that, of course, is to accurately capture time and expense. So in the past, it was kind of okay to have our increments, to write down on a piece of paper what our increment was, and at the end of the week or the end of the month, maybe to bill that, capture that in our system, and send out an invoice. Increasingly, that simply isn't tenable. Expense and time capturing systems need to be a core integral part of our internal systems so that we can get real-time insights and analyses as to how our project is tracking. Our stakeholders and our customers, our clients can see that as well. And increasingly, that's going to be the difference, because in order to run analyses over specific projects or part of specific projects, we need all of those different functions to be closely connected. Project accounting is obviously critically important. It's always been important to run project accounting, but the difference now is that we have the ability to leverage systems that tie together all of these different parts. So in the past, literally it was months until we had an accurate measure of how a project was doing from a financial perspective, by which time it was too late. Today we can do that in real time because our systems are fundamentally connected. And the bottom line is that we want to maximize project profitability. At the end of the day, we're not in business to be a charity. We're in business to deliver the best outcomes out of particular projects. For the business, that is obviously, the bottom line is margin and profit. And so being able to accurately analyze a project, assess how profitable it is, change on a whim as we need to change the way the project is being run, is really, really critical to being successful in the future. And so we need to think a little bit about connected processes. I would suggest that most financial or back office systems that are used simply haven't kept up with the complexity around modern processes and the way modern organizations work. So what we've got is the situation where organizations may have moved into new sort of subscription or services-based models, but the back office systems haven't moved in time. And so they kind of function as a very sort of old school order to cash model. And they can't keep up with the many different functions that a modern business or a modern process have. And really it's about supporting how engagement works within a modern business. It's no longer linear. In the past, it was very, very structured, and you had this linear progression of how an order worked from opportunity to quote to conversion to invoicing to project to cash or whatever. No longer is it like that. Everything is a lot more organic, and so there's new requirements for ERP systems, and so there's a bunch of different functions. Over here on the chart we have at one end the quote, on the other end we've got renewal. Something that probably never happened before in a product-based company where we had to think about renewals and forecasting based on renewals, and billing that was flexible and could handle changes mid-cycle. If we have a situation where in a software company, for example, where we want to add resource, we want to add users, we want to turn off certain features, being able to do that. As I said before, in terms of the financials of a project, being able to see real-time resource allocation, the whole management of the resource function, time and expense being able to happen in real time as expenses are incurred and as time is used up on a project. Having these things connected is critical. And the great thing,
if I can just take a moment there, because I think that's a really great chart, and I know in my mind it's raising a bunch of questions as you talking about the services business, but then in the background in your introduction, the as a service model, and I guess questions that are raising in my mind is which bits of those are critical if you want to take your business down that path of the full digital online as a service. Which of these bubbles need to be compressed down and made to go faster? And I guess this is just a reminder also to the audience, because I'm sure you're thinking the same way. A couple of questions, just to open up your side panel and chuck your questions in. We'll have Q&A at the end, so just don't have no hesitation to fire questions into there. I can see them as they come up, and we'll address them at the end. So Ben, carry on.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it raises a really interesting point. And the great thing is, because what's happening, in the traditional model, it was very, as I said before, it was very linear. So we had one process, that process kicked off, it was completed, and then we had the next process. It's no longer like that, and all of these processes kind of happen quite freeform, sort of contemporaneously in their own time. And that's even more of a critical reason why we need a connected system, because if our system doesn't fundamentally and natively connect these different processes all in real time, then obviously by definition we have a disconnect, but we're unable to gain visibility into those different things. So to answer, which of these things is critical, the really important thing to remember is that all of these things are critical, and by leveraging a connected system, all of these things can happen at the same time, in their own time, but we can increase, or we can create visibility across all of them. So it's really about changing the way we think from very much a sort of a waterfall Gantt chart, division A passes on to division B, and so on and so forth, through to a let's collaborate, let's work on all these different things at once. So a good example there might be if we were a subscription business, and we had a customer that wanted to mix up the way they were billed. They wanted to change the way their subscription worked. We can have a situation there where the billing function can collaborate with the proposal function, formerly two siloed divisions, and they can collaboratively come up with a solution or come up with some models that work within the context of the broader whole. So really it is about connecting that agility for an organization.
So I mean, a recurring theme is the integration across your systems and visibility of the whole. In terms of handling your business model, agility is the fundamental capabilities needed there, and I guess a key area of focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I can't overstate. So I'm involved in a bunch of different businesses in a bunch of different areas, and the pain and the slowing down that having disconnected systems causes is just amazing. And it's incredible when you see connected systems put in place, especially within a service organization, just the gains in efficiency. And it's not just about efficiency as a way to save cost. It's about efficiency as a way to really, really drive revenue, because you're adding value on top of the fact that these systems are all connected. And fundamentally it comes down to this agility question. And your organization in the future, we had often businesses had one sort of revenue stream, one kind of revenue center, and so reporting was pretty easy. But in the future, it's about being able to kind of view multiple revenue streams of different types, all at the same time. And even if those streams are being measured differently, so you might have some subscription revenue, some managed services revenue, some legacy product revenue, and being able to see that all together in one dashboard, running analysis over all of it, is really important. And the great thing that it allows you to do, because often organizations say, yeah, that's fine if you're a greenfields opportunity, but we've got this existing, legacy business. How do we do this new stuff within the context of our old stuff? And that's the key thing here. We're talking about being able to, for existing organizations, add new business models layered on top of existing business models. So not disrupting their existing models, or even the way, from a accounting perspective, how they recognize the revenue for those services or those products, but doing the same together. And that's increasingly super important with the new accounting standards around revenue recognition. It's something that I've talked about in my writing and prior webinars, but clearly the new revenue recognition standards are going to create huge difficulties for companies around when do they recognize revenue, how do they cover expenses across revenue that's going to be recognized in different periods. And so for that reason alone, that's kind of a trigger point at which to think about core systems, because chances are your legacy systems aren't going to be able to support the new revenue recognition requirements. And the flexibility is really important. So increasingly, when we look at successful service organizations, they have hyper flexibility when it comes to their time and the talent that they have. So being able to balance supply and demand with new models, and that potentially can mean some in-house resource, some contract resource, some partnership with other stakeholders groups or whatever. So being able to get that resource and dynamically assign it to both new and old opportunities in terms of really optimizing the way that resource is allocated is really critical. And it's about, again, doing that flying blind without the analysis layered over the systems is pointless. But if we can run analysis to actually see where is the best place, the most efficient place, the optimal place to deploy resource, it's critical. And then I've talked about it a lot around the analytics. It's about constantly learning from the people within the organization, from the products and services you're selling, and from the processes you use. And in the past, obviously, it was a world that wasn't connected. Running analysis over these sorts of processes was, if not impossible, it was very, very, very difficult. Today, that's a lot easier. Analytics has been democratized. Most modern platforms will have analytics built in. Deriving those analytics across different solutions is actually pretty easy. So we can, again, it's a lot easier to really leverage and ramp up the utilization and the efficiency of the resource allocation. And so I want to talk a little bit about a couple of different case studies, completely different organizations we've heard of, but it's worth reflecting upon. And the first one is Amazon, and this is obviously very relevant to Australian, New Zealand companies because Amazon have said that they are building a physical fulfillment center in Australia and are actively targeting this market. And clearly, just this week they closed their purchase of Whole Foods. But if you look at the way Amazon operates, it's really, really interesting. I mean, pretty much the entire model is based around a service-based model. Agility is absolute critical for them. It's kind of a funny thing, but Amazon have an internal rule that no team within the organization can be bigger than can be fed on a couple of pizzas. So the idea being that when a team gets too big, when an organization or a unit gets too big, it slows down. And Amazon is absolutely hyper-focused on speed. Their number one priority is innovating and being as agile as possible. And that's the key thing for us to remember here in our market. As I said before, it's easy to think that we're protected, that we're isolated, that we're insulated by these changes. But this stuff's coming. If you're in retail, Amazon's going to eat your lunch. If you're in media, clearly, the Netflix and iTunes and Spotify's of this world are going to eat your lunch. If you're in traditional professions, be it accounting or law, there's technologies that are coming down to eat your lunch. So you need to find ways to innovate and to continue innovating, because continuing that cycle is very critical. The second example.
Just a question that's come in from Adam. Thank you, Adam. And it might be just helpful in framing these stories up around definition of a service. You think about Amazon. It's logistical. It's product based. It's very supply chain, very hands on. And yet it's probably, it's a classic example of as a service without the software in front of it. Have you got a definition in your mind in terms of how you define a service-based organization? What's the I suppose widgets come to mind, but
yeah. So I mean, the thing with Amazon is clearly what they're selling is they're selling the use of their massive system to others. So whether you're somebody selling a widget on Amazon, whether you're someone using Amazon's logistics services, whether you're using computing resources from Amazon Web Services, you're basically leveraging their infrastructure. They're selling that to you as a service. And so I think it's, for me, anytime anyone is selling the physical or virtual asset they have on a consumption-based model, to me, that's as a service. And so, that's the key thing. And in the past, we bought, we subscribed to a newspaper. Increasingly, what we're going to do is we're going to micro subscribe to lots of different things. We're not going to own assets. We're going to pay for their use and pay for their use as we need them, and that's a really good segue onto General Electric, because GE is well known as a big industrial company. So it makes gas plants, it makes jet engines for airplanes, it makes these sort of huge industrial things. But increasingly what it does is actually it sells services. And so General Electric, with its jet engine business, no longer sells jet engines to airlines. What it does is it sells outcomes. It sells outcomes as a service. And so there's all these cliches about how much data a jet engine accumulates on a transatlantic flight, and it's huge amounts of data. And General Electric crunches that data in order to make their jet engines more efficient, not because it's going to save their customers money through a more efficient jet engine, but because General Electric can sell their service or sell their services level agreement as a service. And increasingly it's happening in a bunch of different areas. And it's really interesting to note, relevant to note, that General Electric has invested literally billions and billions of dollars to become a service company. So this is a company with a massive footprint, a massive business, massive opportunity to grow that business, and yet it's investing via software to become a service business, which is a really interesting change. And it's about changing those business models. We get excited about technology. I'm a technology analyst and an evangelist, and so it's really easy to focus on technology for its own kind of purposes. But at the end of the day, this isn't about technology. It's about business. It's about how business can change. Because there's one thing that is true, and that is that change is just ahead. That the world is changing. The world in which our organisations operate is changing. And our organisations, if they want to survive and prosper, are going to have to similarly change, because there really is no option. In the past, you had an option. You could sort of rest on your laurels and just enjoy the fruits of your labour, but those days have gone. So here's my contact details. I'm more than happy to engage with people on the call via email or Twitter or what have you. But what I'd like to do now is to open it up to Q&A. Everyone will have the question screen in front of them, and Haydens checking those, and he's gonna lead that part and ask the hard questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben, and great insights. So, I think the big one in my mind, the Uber, the taxi company that has no taxis, and Airbnb, the hotel company that has no hotels, contrasted with GE, is a massively asset-intensive industry, and yet both, migrated into that world of everything as a service. The digital capabilities, I suppose, is part of it. As you say, Phil's raised a question that a lot of these businesses and the case studies and the things that we see regularly are US based or big global corporations. Is this stuff something we need to worry about down in this part of the world? Is it, we're much more kind of personal, one-to-one type relationship businesses around here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Phil. And I think it raises a few things. And so the first thing is, absolutely yes. Given Amazon's entry into our market, clearly it is something we need to worry about. But what's actually interesting for me is that I think Phil raises a really good point around the fact that we are small and connected, and we do offer really good service, and we have a relationship with our customers. And this isn't a case of throwing that all out to find these new models, but it's about leveraging that we already do really well with a new kind of a new business model. And so I think it is a real opportunity. And what interests me is that arguably when we've tried to emulate US models here in New Zealand, it hasn't been particularly successful. And there's a bunch of different examples of sometimes large corporates that have tried to go down kind of a route of kind of ripping off a US business and kind of relabeling it down for us. And I don't think that's the way forward. I think the way forward is to do what we do really, really well, but apply some of this stuff, some of this new way of thinking to it, and kind of better together, I guess, to use a cliche.
Yeah, look, I guess it's that globalization, democratization. Everyone can access the best in the world, and yet a lot of people have a loyalty to local service providers. I guess here, the Zoomy in New Zealand versus Uber, starting sort of fledgling and very slowly, but surely it's starting to get a presence as being the local provider. So I guess it's a matter of being able to emulate this. You've got to compete. You've got to be global best practice, and once you achieve that, then you can play the local card. Jenny raises a question around, and thinking across everyone in the audience in the context of the businesses that they represent. Some industries and software is the often used and common example with software as a service, but there are many others lend themselves to as a service. And some businesses are obviously entirely service-based, consulting, accounting practices, and so on. Is that just a fact, and as a service, and taking that to its full extent is just something that in some industries is going to likely happen, or can any business take this model and make it work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, again, I mean, I'm a little bit loath to use US examples because the retort is always that they won't work here. But if we look at things like Dollar Shave Club, where you can subscribe to a razor service, or Trunk Club, where you can subscribe to having socks and underwear or whatever sent to you. Who would have thought that people would be buying clothing or shaving, grooming items that way? And increasingly that is happening. So I would suggest this comes back to a sort of a design-led thinking question, which is, if you're in a traditional organization, how do you even start to have a conversation where you can kind of try and predict what your business would look like in the future under a sort of a service-based or subscription-based model? And that comes down to like spending time outside of the organization, having some people with fresh thinking kind of help around that ideation, I guess. All of those sorts of things to help, help the creative juices flowing, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So another question from Adam, and just drawing a little bit on the noise and hype, I guess, that's around digital transformation. Are we talking the same thing here? Is the end game the ability to digitize your business to the point where, as a service, someone just jumps on, subscribes, and your onboarding processes are so efficient that, and your delivery process is so efficient that you essentially let the technology run the business for you?
Yeah, it's funny. It really depends who you ask. And so if you ask, some of the startup folks around Australia and New Zealand, they will say that technology is going to replace everything, and that will be the answer, and we'll do everything in an automaton-like way. I'm not quite so black and white about it. I think that there's absolutely still a place for traditional business, traditional ways of doing things that won't be completely digitally disrupted. So one of the things I do, I own a company that makes workwear, outdoor clothing, and backpacks and the like. The fact of the matter is, that business is never going to be disrupted replaced by automation or by a digital platform. People still will want to wear clothes, but what people will do, and what we're increasingly doing, is applying digital technologies to that business, either from simple things like social media to have a conversation with our customers, or tools for people to be able to customize or to acquire products. So it's not about replacing traditional businesses, it's about augmenting the way businesses work. So applying technology where it is appropriate and it is additive to a business where it has something to offer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so Steve, thank you for your question. That has come in with a view of having just recently been in the States, seen companies like JCPenney, Macy's, and Sears all looking to their online sales channels, and really impacting the shopping malls and that sort of bricks and mortar retail, and I guess shopping malls are taking the brunt of that. And literally, sorry, Steve, just reading your question as I talk, but stores vacating, including Sears and Santa Monica, where he always used to go. And how far away do you think it'll be before we see those same impacts happening in this part of the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I personally wouldn't be investing in shopping mall real estate. I'm not a commercial real estate advisor, so don't take my advice as a golden ticket. But at the end of the day, I think about my kids. I've got two boys, two teenage boys, 15 and 17, and the reality is they don't actually want to go to shops. They don't, they want to order stuff online. They might want to have a relationship with someone of influence or people of influence, but they don't want to do that in the usual fora that maybe our generation did. So I think it's going to happen far quicker than we think. I mean, I'm not. There's a lot of people out there who are sort of saying that's it, the end is nigh. It's all going to change tomorrow. I wouldn't say that, but if we see how quickly, for example, the warehouse has completely, decimated, the warehouse and other big box retailers have decimated, small town New Zealand. I mean, I remember in the days before Rebel Sports, where every little town had a little sports shop. Today, that's not the case, and that's happened in the space of, maybe 20 years, but probably 10 really. I think that acceleration is going to continue, and I do worry about our traditional businesses, which is exactly why we should leverage the things we can do differently. We can have a relationship with our customers, leverage technology to deliver services and subscriptions in new and innovative ways, but do so in a way that we connect with them better than an Amazon, if you will do.
Yeah, so this whole democratization of technology really does need to be embraced down at the local supplier level, and really think about how you want to engage with your customers to counter the influence of the major global brands, and the local arrival of Amazon is the classic example. Fiona has raised a question looking at the food industry, and apologies to the Australians in the audience, but food bag is the example she's raised, which has been massively successful in the New Zealand environment. And sorry, I can't think of this. I know there's one in Australia, or a few in Australia, that are doing the same thing, which is your meals and recipes delivered as a service. In the food industry, being specifically, these food producers bypassing, to an extent, they're bypassing the supermarket channels. Do you see that is continuing, and where's the food industry going to go with this idea?
Yeah, I think it's going to become quite polarized. So on the one hand, you will have the huge big box chains that are about lowest price, and so the likes of the Pack and Saves, or the sort of low cost people, the likes of Costco, for example, or maybe the Amazons of this world that will just do potentially subscription-based services, but primarily online, and their leverage is going to be their scale and their logistics. But then on the other hand, you're going to have more of this sort of artisanal offerings, and it's amazing. Farmers markets, go to any city or town in New Zealand or Australia or anywhere really, and farmers markets are huge, and that's because consumers want to have a connection with the person that grew their food, made their jam, made their hipster leather pouch or whatever, and so increasingly there's this kind of bifurcation. On the one hand, there's the return to small-scale, artisanal, connected product and services. On the other, there's a move to automation, leverage, and scale. And so we're going to have that sort of huge division, and anyone in the middle between those two worlds is going to be in a world of pain, I think.
Yeah, moving with the times, I guess, and understanding your community and customer base and engaging with them directly is fundamental and always has been. Okay, got a question from Donovan Jackson, our very own Donovan Jackson from iStart, and I guess it's a theme that we've seen across the technology sector. With automation and artificial intelligence and that you described analytics as being democratized, but this is kind of the next step with that process is where the basis of our digital footprint is almost predicted for us, and things are presented even before we ask for them almost. Do you see within this kind of service economy that having a significant influence in terms of future trends?
Yeah, it's funny. So there's obviously a lot of resistance because people have this kind of big brother sort of queasy thought around this. But in the same way that, I love the fact that when I search for something on Google, it offers me up search results that are in context with who I am and what I do. I always joke about the fact I'm a bit of a coffee snob. And so I quite like the fact that my phone, when I'm in a new city that I haven't visited before, will make suggestions for great coffee places. Yes, Google or Apple or whoever has, in inverted commas, has spied on me to know that I'm into coffee. But frankly, if I get offered a better espresso, I don't mind. I don't see any harm in that. So I think that there's a bit of a generational change happening. I believe that the next generation, the millennials, are pretty comfortable with that whole sort of automation, analytics, insights, data mining type area, and I think that increasingly it'll just become the norm. And it's a funny analogy, but I always remember, I was pretty early on with most of the social media platforms, and I remember in the early days when I got on Facebook, and I remember having a conversation with my wife, and she was like, "Oh, that's ridiculous. If I want to talk to my friends, I'll ring them up, or I might send them an email. Or, why would you want to join Facebook? It's such a waste of time." Literally every morning, she gets her phone and spends half an hour in bed checking up on her old university mates or what her family's up to or whatever. And so these things have a habit of changing really, really rapidly, and there's always this adoption curve that there's the early adopters and then the middle majority and these sorts of things. But increasingly the velocity at which adoption happens is speeding up remarkably.
Yeah, I think the convenience word is a very good one. It's approaching things. How can I make myself as absolutely as easy to engage with and as convenient as possible? And the one that wins is the most convenient generally. Couple of questions in theme, and folks, we've got a little bit more time on the clock and a couple more questions, but you've got Ben on hand, so do fire any questions you've got through, and I'll hopefully we'll have time to address them. So yeah, a couple of questions around the theme and drilling specifically into organizational strategy and looking at ways to approach the problem, if you will, within a kind of executive table. What are the key kind of areas to look at to start heading down this path? What are the steps that should be taken? What's your advice in that space, Ben?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really hard, and someone who owns and runs businesses, it's really hard to think about blue skies when you're worried about paying the bills, putting the food on the table, or whatever. And so the key thing is it needs to come from the top. So there's no point trying to drive this from the bottom. There needs to be buy-in for this transformation from the highest levels. But once you've got buy-in, it's actually about having time and breathing room. And so something I do a lot of consulting with organizations around this kind of design-led thinking and design for the future and those sorts of things. And really the key thing is to identify a group of people who think this way and who are creative and who are maybe have a tendency towards being early adopters, and take them out of the organizations, have them spend some time looking at completely different organizations. If you're an FMCG, fast moving consumer good company, then you could argue that the only companies you want to look at are FMCG companies and seeing what they're doing in the space. But I would argue that you want to look at Apple and Amazon and the banks and entertainment, and you want to look at the models they're using and the strategies they've taken to reinvent, how you can apply that to your own business, because increasingly innovation doesn't happen within a vacuum. It doesn't happen within, I think Steve Jobs is obviously a bit of cliche and is always held up, but the interesting thing with him is that he took knowledge and experience and insights from so many different areas, be it Asian religions or calligraphy or whatever, and applied it to building software and building computers. And I think that was the beauty, among other beauties, of what he did at Apple.
So yeah, get your head up out of the trenches and look around and I guess difficult to do that in kind of a deliberate way, but there's so many different ways of thinking and bringing those examples in. So yeah, interesting. Okay, question picking up on your artisan comment, and it's an interesting one because it draws into that, but and I'll take it a little bit further than what Steve's posed. Is obviously you've got a product proposition that people feel an affinity with, and they want to be part and within that community. Social media then becomes an engagement channel that the brand can engage with that audience through its semi-personal contact. So where's that channel going to go, and is that something that's important? And I know that the examples where Facebook Messenger, two people talking about getting together for a beer later on, and then suddenly Uber pops in as do you want to grab an Uber, and suddenly you're in an Uber ordering transaction because you've been in that obviously setting up a meeting type dialogue. Do you see those sort of capabilities, and I guess taking commerce transactions and bringing them into one-on-one brand consumer conversations, the trading platform becomes the social media?
I think that labor the point is around connected systems, and the thing is that a lot of these organizations are using Twitter, are using Facebook or whatever, but that's in isolation, and often that's not scalable. And so using those platforms, integrating those platforms with their core systems, with their CRM or their ERP or whatever, but also applying, whether it's bots or whatever, to be able to automate some of those low-level processes and to kind of take some of the drag out of the system or the cost out of the system in order to be able to more efficiently, more proactively offer value to customers, and in doing so, to improve the profitability and size of the business.
So all part and parcel, and yeah, I guess everyone needs to be doing everything all at once, and especially if you're looking to compete with best practice models. Everyone's got a social media channel, and everyone is actively engaging on it. So yeah, yes, part of the strategy probably not going to be the core platform. You've got to have that online e-commerce capability as well, to service the customers, and yeah, down as the farmers markets and pressing the flesh is obviously in that particular segment key part of it. Okay, so drawing a little bit to a close, we've got a question from Max. I'll address that, and then we'll bring things to a close. Sorry, Max, I've just seen it come in, and I'm reading it as we talk, but I'll read it out as you've written it. What is the initial reason usually driving the early adopters to use a disruptive solution as opposed to the traditional solution? And this is exploring ideas around cost savings, filling a gap, and delivering outstanding user experience.
Yeah, so I kind of turn that question around a bit, which is, what are the barriers to legacy organisations or existing organisations not using these systems? And it comes down to legacy systems. And so, if you are if you decide tomorrow that you've got this good idea and you're going to set up Uber. Uber doesn't exist, Lyft doesn't exist, Zoomy doesn't exist. You're going to do that, and you have complete greenfields opportunity. You don't know how fast you're going to grow. You don't know how big it's going to get. All you do know is that you need to connect a bunch of different things. You need to be able to do charging, in real time. You need to be mapping in real time. All these sorts of things. You would absolutely use a cloud-based system, an on-demand system, because A, it gives you that connectivity, that connectedness out of the box, and B, it allows you to scale at will. There aren't constraints around infrastructure, around licensing, around these sorts of things. So for a greenfields business, i.e. for a new business or a new opportunity within an existing business, which is going to be standalone, there is absolutely no question. Cloud connected systems are the way to go. There's no question in my mind. The question then is that if you're an existing business and you want to do some new stuff, what's your decision-making process, your thought process around your core systems, your legacy systems versus maybe rolling out some new systems? And this is a difficult one. It's difficult because you've got sunk costs, you've got a significant investment in your existing systems. I have to say, though, that from what I've seen with the organizations I've worked with, often there is no choice. That existing systems are just so dysfunctional, so inflexible, that you just can't innovate within them. So, every organization is different, every system is different, but increasingly, unfortunately, the cost and the heartache out of changing systems is one you can't avoid. And what I would say is that the benefits it's going to pay down the line outweigh the disadvantages of moving.
Yeah, so a willingness to move and an understanding that IT becomes an investment, not a cost, is a pretty fundamental step to take, and then take the pain of the project and move your capabilities on, and then your enablement is I guess the barriers are taking away to start to consider these models. All right, look, fantastic. Thank you, everyone in the audience, and thank you, Ben, for your presentation. I'll just grab the controls back and bring things to a close. So folks, just as you leave the webinar today, you'll get a prompt to complete an exit survey. Please just give us your frank and honest answers in there. There's some options in terms of hearing more from Financial Force in terms of their specific proposition and capabilities in this area. And obviously good feedback for us for holding these events in the future. Thanks specifically to our sponsor, Financial Force, and you may not have heard of Financial Force. You would be excused if you hadn't. They are reasonably new to the ERP scene, but you have probably heard of one of their founding investors, which is Salesforce. Financial Force is built on the force.com platform, so it's fully integrated with a whole bunch of ecosystem applications that play on that platform. And they've also had backing from Unit 4, which is not a lot of a massive footprint down here, but a large European and mature ERP provider. So in terms of heritage, they've got pretty good credentials in that web native software world, and also ERP in terms of their ownership. They've just hit $100 million annual revenue and growing at 40%. So likelihood is you're going to hear a little bit more from them. And they've just set up a Sydney office and up to 22 staff and that's running full sales support and project implementation out of Sydney. So they're very much in the region and keen to engage with like-minded businesses. They've got a couple of solutions within their offerings. One is specifically professional services automation, so your consulting and services-based businesses, and the other is in just a cloud-based financial management solution that has a module specifically built around subscription-based billing. So if that's an area of interest, check them out, financialforce.com, and the local office number is there on the screen. So thank you everyone for getting along and spending the time today. Thank you very much, Ben. Interesting presentation as always, and your insights from the US world is always valued, and interpretation from a North Canterbury perspective is always appreciated too. Keep an eye on your inbox. We'll have the recording through to you tomorrow. Financial Force will also be in touch with an opportunity to follow up with them directly. All right, thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Hayden. Thanks, everyone.
Great. I'll bring things to a close. Cheers.